Hello and welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. Kevin Richardson, an assistant professor of philosophy at Duke University. Hi, Professor Richardson. How are you today?
I'm doing great today. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast. I'm very happy to be here.
Of course, and thank you so much for your time and obviously being here today. Before we begin our discussion, I want to ask you, how'd you get into philosophy? What interested you, or what was interesting to you in philosophy, and like what stood out to you?
Thanks. I started as an English major, so I was really interested in literature. And I was really interested in writing fiction. So I took the creative fiction writing classes. And I slowly realized that I was more into the philosophy of the books, the philosophical ideas and themes of the literature than I was the actual literature. So I looked at the English majors, like what you have to do to get an English major, what you have to read. And I thought, definitely don't want to read that. That's one thing. And in my creative fiction writing classes, I remember one time a teacher said to me, Kevin, your characters, they're just ideas, right? They're not well-rounded. They're just ideas. You're just writing, these philosophical, these characters, but they don't, they represent these big ideas. They don't actually, they're not actually relatable in a human way. And that kind of experience made me think, okay, yeah, actually philosophy is the thing that I may be interested in here. And so I pursued that. And I think I've always, questioned things growing up. I don't know exactly why I gravitated toward philosophy. So I grew up in a very small southern town in North Carolina with about 1,000 people, right, total. And it's very conservative politically and socially. But for me, I was always questioning things despite people telling me to just leave it alone. And that just continued all throughout my undergraduate career and going into philosophy, and it just now I'm here. So that's a short way to describe my trajectory.
I mean, that's interesting. I think so I'm located in San Jose, which is like a million people, which is like quite the opposite experience that you had. But still, there's a lot of like questioning of practically everything nowadays, which is good in some ways. Sometimes it's not great because I feel like there's some things that you need to leave unquestioned. But at the same time, like that's like a really interesting route. And I think like English to philosophy, there's like a lot of philosophy embedded in English. Like just I think that's a lot of ways, at least at a surface level, that's how a lot of high schoolers are interested or are introduced to philosophy. Like they might not know it's philosophy per se, but like at least they're introduced to it through English, which I think is really great. But our topic today is about social indeterminacy and ontological erasure, which sound like very, very big and like scary concepts for anyone listening. But I assure you, we're going to break it down today because they sound really, really cool. So to start off, what exactly is social indeterminacy? What is determinism and what is indeterminism? Because those are some terms I'm sure are going to be tossed around quite often in this podcast. So just to set the record straight, what are those?
Thanks. Yeah, and those are some big terms. I'm going to keep it as straightforward as possible. So just to give an example of what I call social indeterminacy, sometimes there's vagueness in the law. So a famous example of this by a political theorist and philosopher, H.L.A. Hart, he considers a park, right, where there's a sign or there's a statute, right, there's a law that says no vehicles in the park, right? And there are clear cases of vehicles, right? There's, the Mustang that you just bought, or this motorcycle that you just bought. Yeah, those are clearly vehicles. There are things that aren't vehicles, like people, right? We can be in the park, right? But, there are lots of cases that aren't really clear. So, when they say no vehicles in the park, do they mean a bicycle? Or maybe they do mean a bicycle, but what about an electric bicycle? Electric bicycle is kind of close to a motorcycle, isn't it? Or what about, scooters, electric scooters, skateboards? What about the sizes of them? So you start to run into situations where it seems like when these laws are created, they have certain paradigm cases where they determinately apply, as in the case of no vehicles, a car is determinately, right? A case of a vehicle, so the law rules it out. And then there are other cases where it determinately doesn't apply, so a person's not a vehicle, and so yeah, it doesn't go into effect there. But one thing that legal theorists and philosophers have kind of pointed out is that there's a range of cases where it's open-ended. And it seems like the meaning of the concept and the way the world is, it simply hasn't been determined by the law, right? The people, however, whatever theory you have of how laws work and how they apply, there seems to be a kind of gap, right, between the determinate yes cases and determinate no cases. And that gap is what I focus on, what I think about when I think about social indeterminacy. It's a case where, because of the way we define the social world, things aren't fully determinate. We don't have a complete characterization of where things fall, right? There's two categories, vehicle, non-vehicle, but we have these in-between cases. And then, okay, what do you say about those cases? So I can say more about the indeterminism and determinism language, but at first I want to see if that makes sense before kind of jumping into something else, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so from what I can tell, it seems almost as if like there are these hoops, right, where it's like, okay, there's either a yes or no, and there may be like specific cases that apply to produce a yes, or specific cases that apply to produce a no. But if there are these cases that don't meet any of these criteria, but still are placed as a yes, or still are placed as a no, or maybe aren't even yes or no's, but those are like the cases that you're exploring, right? Those that don't fit into those, like those determinate yes or no like scenarios, right?
Yes. Another example is just racial vagueness. So someone says, oh, are you Black? Well, I have two Black parents, so I'm Black. Okay, cool. All right, well, what if one parent is Black and another is white? You say, well, in America, people say, well, you're still Black. If you have one Black parent, you're Black. There you go. I say, okay, fine. Well, okay, now you just keep adding, you keep changing the case. You think, well, what if you have one parent that's half Black and half white, another that's white? And then you start to ask, okay, are you Black now? Because now you have a half, or two parents, both of which are half Black and half white. And then, okay, do you end up being Black by that? So you keep tweaking the cases, of course, and I'm not trying to say this half language makes any sense, but I'm trying to get, people get a sense of what I mean here, that at some point, there's going to be a gap in terms of, hey, this person isn't there, it's not determinate that they are Black, racially Black. It's not determinate that they're not racially Black. It seems like there's indeterminacy here, right? There's a lack of fact of the matter about whether this person is or is not Black. And I think those kind of cases arise in the case, not just in the law, but they rise with race. I would consider that a social case. I think they arise with gender and gender identity. And I think they arise with a sexual orientation. And, for instance, gender, you may not, determinately fall within the boundaries of a man or a woman, right? And so then, what do you do? Well, how are you to be characterized in such cases? Now, the terminology of determinism and indeterminism, so that is tough. So I will say sometimes these terms are used to name very different philosophical theories, right? These titles or these phrases are used to name very different philosophical theories. I think in the present context, it's useful to think of the contrast in terms of these yes no, these questions, right, that you might ask about individuals. So if you ask the question, for instance, are you Black, right, and racially Black, and there are two broad ways to approach that question, two broad ways to think about answers to that question. And one way is look, there are only two possible answers here, right? And it's either yes or no, right? There's just a fact of the matter, either yes or no, right? And one of those answers has to be correct, right? That's one stance, and that would characterize someone who believes that the social world, at least, is fully determinate. A race is fully determinate. If you have that question, are you racially Black? There's a yes, no answer, and those are the only answers, right? And you have to fit into at least one, right? You see the yes or no. But if you believe in indeterminacy, then you may think the question, are you Black, racially Black, when asked of at least some individuals, there's not going to be a fact of the matter about what the answer is. So it's not that the person with half Black, half white parent one and half Black, half white parent two, it's not as if there's a secret fact about whether they're Black or not, that we're struggling to figure out, are they really, and we just fail. That's not what's going on. There's not a lack of knowledge here. There's a lack of fact. There just isn't anything that is going to decide the issue, right? It's very much like, again, it's very much like cases of vagueness, right? People ask questions about, okay, how many, if a person with 56 hairs on their head, are they bald, right? So, okay, what about 57? Are they bald? 58, right? You ask these kinds of questions. At some point, you'll say, there's no fact of the matter. It's indeterminate whether the person is bald or not, because we're now in this zone, right? This middle ground, this gap that doesn't allow us to give a determinate answer. And so I think determinism and indeterminism in this context is just going to be the contrast between what types of answers you think these questions about social categories have.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. And I guess because this is really relevant as well right now, what exactly is the social then? Like when we're talking about the social, are we talking about like the literal bonds that humans are like form as like a primal tendency? Or are we talking about some sort of political structure? I guess maybe politics and social are different, but like the social structure as a whole, or what exactly is that social structure and the social? Like who does it include and who does it not include? Sorry.
Oh, no, yeah. So sorry about that. That's a very good question. And it's something that, philosophers are try to give definitions of. Is actually very tough. But I give some examples, though. The social, as I understand it, it involves things like, basically it involves people who are coming together in some way. So obvious cases of this, laws are going to be social. Culture is going to be something that's social. Institutions are social, right? Institutions, whether they're formal institutions like the government or they're informal institutions like family, like the family is an institution in some sense. Those are examples of social things. What wouldn't be an example of something social? I think, one, just an individual feeling however they might feel about things. Maybe this is contentious, but it's not social in the relevant, in the broad sense that I'm thinking about right now. And also, obviously, certain things wouldn't be social, like at least not in the relevant sense. So, rocks, for instance, they're not social beings. Rocks, they aren't animate, and so they don't really count as social. And maybe some animals aren't really social creatures or isolated, solitary creatures. But then maybe there's some definitely animals that could be considered social. So usually people don't talk as much about the animal case, how did I mention it? But those are broadly speaking. When I talk about social, I'm being pretty broad here. I'm not being too specific, right? We just want to make a distinction between rocks and particles smashing each other that aren't involving humans. And then, institutions, social groups, social norms, and so on.
Okay, so we're almost talking about like a bird's eye view of a lot of different things that happen in society, right? Is that like a good way to summarize it almost?
Yeah. And then I think in my case, I think a lot about social identity to keep it more grounded. So things like race and gender and sexual orientation and gender presentation. So yeah, I focus mainly on those. Social indeterminacy, though, is strictly speaking a broader idea.
Okay, and so like in that I guess in that concept, is that like each person's, like when you're analyzing maybe like social identity, right? Is that each person's opinion all combined into like this one kind of social identity or opinion on social identity? Like for example, like we're going to be talking about kind of or I guess problems with like biraciality in terms of how it's perceived, right? Are those things like a combination of a lot of different people's opinions on the matter, or like how, I'm just trying to figure out how you can like call something to be the social norm or something like that. Like at what level can you classify that something is a norm or something is prevalent? Is it like more than 50% of these people believe a certain thing? Do you kind of get what I'm trying to like say?
Oh,
How you can you quantify that?
right. So I think that, when it comes to, just to use a specific case, so what's the interaction between, suppose you think about sexual orientation as something, as example of something social, and how do you kind of define that, right? With respect to people's identities. So two quick things I would say is that first, it's social just because, sexual orientation, you have two people who are, at least one person is oriented to another person in some sense, whether it's desire or what kind of sexual behavior they may engage in. And so there's kind of relationships there that I would consider social, human social reaction relationships. So that's kind of but that's a kind of minor thing. The second thing I would say though is, it is tricky thinking about, how to define these things, because so in the sexual orientation case, and the reason why I use this case is, people can be, people arguably can be mistaken about their sexual orientation. So, people might have, you may kind of go about in the world thinking that you are of one sexual orientation. But then come to find out, if you really analyze the content of your desires or even your behavior, depending on however you define sexual orientation, you might discover that, oh, actually, the things that I've told myself about myself aren't true when it comes to my sexual orientation. And so in those cases, it's tricky to theorize about, because if you only use what people thought about themselves as input for your theory, then your theory would end up misclassifying a lot of people, or at least intuitively, we think there's a gap between the way people see themselves with respect to their sexual identity and what they actually are. And the same case can be made of kind of racial case. The gender case is more controversial for various reasons, which we can get into. But I mean, even then, I mean, the methodological questions are really, really tough, and I can say more about them, but in general, what we're looking for is, we're trying to find ways that do make sense of people's experiences, but without taking everyone's testimony on board, because then we're not going to have any kind of way of wrangling in all of the intuitions and judgments people have.
All right, yeah, I think that definitely makes sense and clears that up. And you kind of mentioned this briefly, like when we're talking about race and I guess a little bit about gender and sexuality. But why exactly does like social indeterminacy help capture those experiences that maybe a theory based on just like input or like people's input may not be able to classify? Like what is the distinction here that we're able to look at and actually like explain those experiences better, hopefully?
Yeah, so we often use binaries to make sense of social identities. So the black-white racial binary is one example. The heterosexual, homosexual kind of binary, man, woman. In many of these cases, the binaries are meant to be either fundamental or kind of exhaustive. You fit into one or the other, and exclusive, so you can't fit into both. My claim is that a lot of identities are going to end up being left out here if we use these binaries as being fundamental. And our institutions and social norms don't know how to treat people with these identities, for instance. So let me I'll start with two examples, right? So there was a guy who was robbing banks in LA. It's very famous. He robbed like 30 banks. And people are trying to figure out who is this person? I mean, some people say, oh, he's Latino, he's Arab, he's Black, he's what? It turns out he was biracial. It was this biracial bank robber was off to people's off of people's radars. Why? Because people could not figure out how to categorize this individual using the black-white binary. So in his case, it actually, he lucked out because no one, I mean, eventually I think caught him, but for a while, I mean, he was able to benefit from the fact that the way we categorize, the way we pick out people, right, for something as important as criminal justice, is going to depend on like these binary categories. But, and this leads to him not being identified. And I think this is, his invisibility here, his erasure here, benefited him, right, economically. But it's something that you might not want to build your entire, you don't want to build your criminal justice system around these assumptions, right? You have to, insofar as you want to pick out certain individuals to hold them accountable, insofar as that's permissible, you want to be able to categorize people in a way that, captures more of who they are. Another case I think is worth, that I've been thinking about lately is when sexual orientation. There's Larry Craig was this former Republican U.S. senator. And so he was caught soliciting sex from another man in a public, an undercover cop, right, in some bathroom somewhere. And he was like known as an anti-gay legislator. And, when that incident happened, he swore up and down that he's straight, he's not gay, he's not gay. The media, right, had a view of his sexuality, which said that he was a hypocrite because, well, here's this anti-gay legislator who's secretly gay, right? And this is something the media portrayed it as, he's a hypocrite and all this stuff. But, one thing that some sexuality scholars have thought about with this case is, it's a very simplified view of sexuality. I mean, he might have been a little gay, for lack of a better word. I mean, there's not really using the categories of heterosexual and homosexual, gay and lesbian. Often there's certain, there's a kind of spectrum, or there's certain kinds of sexual behaviors and dispositions that aren't able to be captured using those different categories. So, and in the case of Larry Craig, the thought is, okay, there might be a individual who's, they're mostly heterosexual in some sense. They're mostly right into or desiring the opposite sex or gender, but not fully. And there's a question: oh, well, do we just categorize those people as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual? And there's a lot of literature in the sexuality research which says like, no, it doesn't really capture their sexual orientation. They do use different, people want to use different classifications for, how they think about themselves and how to think about their sexual behavior, sexual orientation. And so I think those are two cases where we see that, if mixed race or multiracial, or if you have a sexuality that doesn't fit the heterosexual, homosexual kind of binary, you end up not being able to identify with society in certain ways. The institutions aren't built around your identities. They're built around heterosexuality, homosexuality, and black and white. They're not built around the things that fall into the gaps, I say, or the things that I think are cases of social indeterminacy.
So I mean, I think that makes sense, and I will have some follow-up questions kind of later about ways in which maybe like institutions can account for that variability. Almost, it seems like I don't know, the way that I was interpreting this is like, having a black and white binary seems like a gray scale, right? Like there's what, like on one end there's white, on the other end there's black, but like in terms like when you're thinking about like a rainbow, right? That's a lot of different colors, and so to account for all of those colors would be quite difficult. But I think there could be some interesting questions, later about how like institutions can address those things. But for now, I kind of want to focus on like how social indeterminacy is able to answer other philosophical questions around race and gender that may have not been explored, or like cannot be answered by other sort of theories. Like, what are those explanations, or like those questions, and why is it useful to even answer those questions with this theory?
So I think if we think about the case of, both race and gender. So I think philosophers for a long time have tried to define race and what the races are. So they've tried to define what's the, what is it to be Black? What is it to be white? What is it to be Asian? What is it to be indigenous? And, they have done the same thing with gender. So what is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman, right? Mostly they've actually just asked the question, what is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? They haven't considered kind of things like kind of non-binary genders or genderqueer or things like that. And they've struggled, I think, to actually give determinate definitions of these whether they're race or their gender, and especially the challenge of defining what is a woman, right? That has been a really big project that's been going on. Thinking about what exactly is the answer to that question, what is a woman? How do you define it? And I think and people have taken different stances. A lot of people have given up on the project. And I think one way in which we have gone wrong is to assume that there's a fully determinate answer to some of these questions, and to assume that, we don't just have social indeterminacy in some of these cases. So for instance, I think, one explanation of why it's so challenging to find an umbrella term woman that encompasses the diversity of like the diversity of women is that, it may not be a fact of matter in many cases about whether someone is a woman, or it may not be a fact of matter about what we mean by woman. It just, there may not be productive things to say there. And that can sound like it's not a very happy conclusion to many people. But I do think that understanding that will, I think, allow us to have a better appreciation of the relevant political terrain. And some of these philosophical theories that are concerned with defining race and they're concerned with defining gender do have like political interests at the end of the day. And so I think it's something that could be helpful in sorting out like why we failed and also how to move forward, because some projects may not be productive.
Right. I think that definitely makes sense. And in terms of like those projects that could be unproductive, I think there's some level of like ontological erasure in those projects. And so I guess talking about that now, what exactly is ontological erasure? I know we've mentioned that at least like once in this podcast, but what is into ontology, and what is the differences or similarities between ontology and metaphysics? Because I know like those two fields can often be like very similar, or at least interpreted at least in a very similar way, because one's like almost the nature of being, and then one is about nature of stuff. So like, could you explain the differences between that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the ontological erasure and then get to the ontology and metaphysics question. So ontological erasure is my name for what happens when an institution wrongs you because your identity falls into the gaps of their classifications. So, an example, a very simple example of this, it happened a lot back in the day. I don't know to what extent it still happens, but when you're filling out your race on forms, you might, there are many cases where multiracial people, there simply is no box for them to check their race, and they're not allowed to check multiple races. And what that means is, from a singular event of checking a box, those boxes are extremely important at the end of the day, because our society is organized around where you fit, right, racially speaking. And if there's no place for people to fit racially speaking, then you're gonna be not in a great position, right? And that's at an institutional level, but it can also be right at just a social norms level where like the the biracial bank robber case is like kind of humorous in a certain way, but there's also, I mean, but in many cases where, people, multiracial people say, look, I was never treated fully a member of any of any particular community. And what does that, how does that shape your, it ends up in many cases shaping your life negatively. And I think, what's distinct of, again, ontological erasure is that, institutions are built around these determinate identities, which it's a question whether that's a good thing in the first place. But that's the case. And now you have an identity that doesn't fit, like in a fundamental way. And so the way you're treated, I mean, you're just going to end up suffering as a consequence of this. And the same thing with, women's colleges is a case I use in my paper where, things are better now by a long shot. But, when it comes to many people with trans identities or gender non-conforming identities who are trying to, get into women's colleges, the colleges would, in some cases, they would outright exclude you, right? So that wouldn't be a case of erasure. It would be a case where I know, I'm making a determined decision to exclude you here based on being trans or whatever, right? But in other cases, there's just gaps, right? They never thought about certain possibilities of gender when they formulated, right? We're having this women's college, they broadly, so it's a women's college. It is what it is. But yeah, when you're at these colleges and you're at these institutions that aren't built for your identity or don't try to accommodate your identity at all, well, you end up suffering or not even getting into these institutions as a result. Now, I call this ontological erasure because, well, let me take a step back. So ontology and metaphysics are often distinguished in philosophy. In this case, though, I am going to just not distinguish them and say they're both about, they're both used to refer to the nature of reality in some way. I mean, ontology is usually meant to talk about existence more so, but, in the case of ontological erasure, and just the terminology I'm using, it's ontological erasure because it's a fact about the world. And that's one thing I want to emphasize. So, it's not just, oh, well, people use words in ways that don't capture your identity, or people use vague words, right? So that's one idea that you have. And look, people do use vague words, but what's distinctive about this is that there are consequences for the worldly consequences for erasure, right? So people, who can't check a box for their race, now, where, certain benefits are afforded to people on the basis of whether they check certain boxes, unfortunately, like it or not, in this society, either informally or formally. And so now, okay, there are worldly consequences. It's not just this linguistic thing. It's, again, the case of colleges. It's not just a linguistic thing. I mean, like, how I'm getting treated is up for grabs now. How the admission process goes for me is going to be different, because with the other women, they kind of have a determinate verdict of whether to let them in because of their gender identity. But with you, all of a sudden, there's a trans woman or a woman who is not considered, for whatever reason, seems different or falls in the gaps of these gender categories. Then it's, oh, well, it's a different process, and maybe they get in, maybe they don't, but it's not the same kind of fair process that you would have had before. And even when you get into college, how are you treated? And that's an entirely different question, because now you have colleges that are, they're more accepting of trans women. They accept trans women, but, well, when you get there, right, do you still have a college that's geared towards cis women entirely? And now you've nonetheless admitted trans women. I mean, there are still cases where you can be erased at one level, even if you're not erased at another level.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I have like two quick follow-up questions. So first is, on the level of like ontological erasure, is the scenario of like biological things to kind of restrict, I guess, like, I don't know, the common example here right now, and the very, very controversial one, is of like trans athletes and the usage of biology to confirm or deny kind of trans athletes participating in specific events. So is that a form of ontological erasure? Because at that level, I don't know if it is still inclined to be a social thing, or would you consider it a social thing, or would it still be like a super, super biological thing? And then second question is kind of about the ways in which ontological erasure affects the human, or like the person being erased. Have you done some research there, and what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so those are good questions. And I think first, one distinction I do want to make is that, erasure is distinct from what I call exclusion. And I think one thing we see now more publicly are instances of trans exclusion. So exclusion would be, I just watched this horror film called They, Them, of Kevin Bacon. And it's like a film where a bunch of LGBTQ and gender non-conforming people go to sexual orientation therapy camps, gay conversion camps, sadly. But at these camps, their identities are very much visible and recognized. So the counselors recognize, yes, you are a trans woman, sure. But they suffer because of their recognition. I mean, they do all sorts of, spoiler alert, but it doesn't go well for the kids at this camp. They suffer because of I'm recognizing who you are, and I'm also saying, yeah, you shouldn't be that way, or you're not going to qualify for this. So that's the case where institutions are actively targeting you on the basis of your identity. Erasure, however, it's not about kind of being actively targeted. It's about not being considered in a fundamental way. So cases of erasure, they're often not as high profile as I think many of the cases that we see in public. So like the athlete case, where they're making determined decisions. They say, oh, we got to define what a woman is by the biology or by the testosterone levels. And so let's define it so we can exclude certain people. Erasure is more so living in a kind of gray area when it comes to navigating these institutions that make gender or race or sexual orientation important, but you don't quite fit in the recognized categories. And so how you relate to the institution is, it's up for grabs. You don't know what race or sexuality or gender to check on the form. And the gender you check or race you check, it's going to be pretty important. It's going to determine where, what dorms do you end up going to, right? What gender you check, or even in some cases with sexuality. And so, the cases we see now, I'll say very quickly, like there's what we see now is there's a recognition in one way of in the case of trans people, and I think that's the biggest, most public case. I think there's a recognition that, yeah, oh, okay, these people exist, but they shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. And that's slightly different from kind of erasure, but it may be, yeah, they have some interesting interactions, but I'll stop there.
Right, that makes sense. And I guess like that kind of answers the question I was about to ask about the ways in which that trans identity is ignored completely. Like that, I think distinction between exclusion and erasure kind of shows how trans identity is like almost ignored completely and that creates like almost an erasure level at that point. And I guess I do want to talk about the ways in which institutions can combat ontological erasure in a way, because it seems that obviously we're talking about the nature of reality and being, but is there a way to change this for the future? Because obviously we know, like, historically that trends have happened. We've been there's been like a rise for inclusion. Obviously we can still do a lot better, but what is that way to do better, and almost like inject trans identity into the social? Although I'm sure that there's other ways to do it, and a lot of critical theorists have identified a lot of ways, but what is a strategy that maybe you have or identify as a way to create more, I guess, inclusion almost here?
Well, first, I would definitely point to there's been a lot of organizations been working for years to get like trans identities, non-binary kind of identities in a broad sense to be recognized, particularly kind of gender and sexual orientation identities, um, in identifying these gaps in institutions. So I definitely think that, kind of supporting the work that they do, because I definitely don't have a immediate strategy that is more advanced than the things they've been thinking about. I mean, it's different in the case of mixed race, multiracial people. That's actually trickier in terms of there's actually reasons why people don't want to recognize people who are in the spectrum between white and black, right? There's a lot of politics there, and it's interesting. But long story short, though, I think one is supporting kind of organizations who really have better strategies to give you than I do. The thing I can say, however, is that fundamentally, I think change when it comes to ontological erasure in general is going to require us to, well, one big part of it is we don't need to use race, gender, and sexual orientation categories as a basis for all of social life, basically. I think the reason why erasure, one big reason why erasure is an issue is because it's important for an institution that you have a certain gender or that you have a certain sexual orientation, or even a certain race. But my claim is like, should we really organize society that way? And so one quick example of this is go to the grocery store and you go to like the toilet paper aisle and you see the wipes. I've seen now they have dude wipes. They have this whole branded dude wipes thing. And it's like or another example, like you have the soap, the Dove soap, but then you have the Dove soap for men, right? The Dove soap, regular soap is white, right? And the white box, the Dove soap for men is like a black box. The same thing with the dude wipes are like black, and green and manly looking into and so this example, do we really need to, bring gender presentation into every aspect of life? Going to the grocery store to get some toilet paper or wipes or soap. Why are these things being gendered? I think in general, that's the same thing about how to combat erasure and exclusion. Like, do we really need gender and sexuality and orientation to be, a reference point for these decisions, which seem like completely independent. I mean, a man and a woman, they could both use the same soap. I mean, it's just the same soap with a different branding and maybe a different smell. We don't necessarily need to have that division, however.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. And I guess there's a lot more, I guess, that we can do on the front lines too, which is about exactly about like the organization that are doing things. Do you have like any names of some of those organizations for any students listening who might want to be interested? If not, you can just maybe tell me like after the podcast, and I can put that in the description.
Yeah, let me give you the names after the podcast, because I don't want to miss any great institutions, and especially ones that I think are directly working on this issue as opposed to more general, I guess, issues in the vicinity of kind of sexual orientation and identity. So I just want to make sure.
Okay, yeah, for sure, definitely. So I'll put a link in the description to a few organizations, or however many that have or that are doing some good work. And if you're interested in helping out, then that would definitely be the first step. And I guess, does ontological erasure also impact the way in which legislature or like the social stratosphere handles issues overall? So like specifically here talking about the relationship between the social and the political and what that means in terms of, I guess, like ignorance at a large scale. For example, I mean, I don't really want to get into too much of like politics, but I know that like a lot of, I guess, rising, I guess, like Republicans from a lot of areas are using anti-trans or anti-gay or LGBTQ rights as a way of getting forward in the bid running or whatever it is. So is ontological erasure a reason for why they're being so successful, and what's the solution to that besides, I guess, these organizations? Is there like a philosophical reason for why this could be the place or something like that?
Yeah. When I think about at the political level, what's interesting to me is the interaction between what I've called exclusion and erasure. because in a way, so in my paper, I think I said, like, in a way, on one hand, erasure can be, pretty dangerous, just because, you're not being recognized and you're kind of at the whim of institutions. They don't have to really treat you fairly or systematically. You're constantly being, your needs are constantly not being met because institutions aren't built for you. But on the other hand, I mean, with exclusion comes the kind of attacks that I think, we're seeing today in a very very public way. So, people are banning books, books on being genderqueer or being non-binary, because, they're explicitly recognizing that book as, oh, they're talking about these non-binary sexual orientations or genders, and they're saying we have to stop that, right? So that, to me, that's a case of exclusion. But I think that at the political level, what we still have, I mean, outside of these highly publicized case of exclusion, at the political level, I mean, what it means is, we just don't have the resources, interpretive resources, to describe whole swaths of people. So multiracial people, I think, is a good example. I mean, there's, what does one even say about, I mean, multiracial itself is a huge, it's a huge category to place people in. If you look at the way that the United States, classifies the races, there's not too much wiggle room there. I mean, maybe, you can check multiple boxes, but I mean, the reality is everything is fundamentally based on the boxes that exist. And so there's nothing else so when it comes to making policy, which is a big deal, okay, you kind of have to, you basically end up ignoring these large swaths of people. And I think the same is going to be true of sexual orientation. And so it's I guess ontologically, what has happened as a consequence of the political stuff is that, we've created a world in which, we have just, we put certain individuals at a disadvantage because they fail to fit inside certain categories that we normally recognize. And this is ontologically, this is the situation that we're in. How to change that, again, I will say, unfortunately, I'm not I have been thinking, I have been thinking a lot more about this recently. But I have to think more because, you're going to need more than, you're going to need more than education, I think, to defeat some of the forces that are allowing for ontological erasure and exclusion. So, and that's very true. Because a philosophy, if I could say, oh, well, we just educate people and that would be great if that was like the straightforward solution, but I suspect that more is going to be needed.
So hopefully Dialexicon is the first step, at least for kids to get involved and like young students, so that they can spread the word about ontological erasure, because I think it's a really interesting concept. And once you kind of hear the point and like, I kind of like, it's eye-opening to see that, yeah, this is really a problem that's taking place. But, we're kind of towards the end of the podcast, and I want to ask you what you're doing now, what your research is entailing, and, maybe audience members who are interested can follow up and read a little bit more about it. I'll also leave a link to your website in the description.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot more. I think that, so of the different social categories, race, gender, sexual orientation, I've been thinking the most lately about sexual orientation. And I think I've been thinking a lot about the cases I mentioned earlier, which is, these kind of what I call non-binary sexual orientations. So not non-binary genders, but non-binary sexual orientations. That is, doesn't fit quite within the heterosexual, homosexual kind of paradigm. I mean, it's more into bisexual, but there's even diversity within that. So think about, okay, yeah, what about cases where a person's a little gay, a little lesbian? There's this phenomenon of straight girls kissing is what, sometimes straight girls kissing is young women in college experimenting. Bi-curious people, okay, what is that? Being heteroflexible, I just introduced that term, heteroflexible. It's like, well, I mean, well, I'm heterosexual, but I'm flexible, and thinking about sexual orientation as coming in degrees, I think has been a recent project of mine, and I'm hoping to get some work out on that. But yeah, you can look at my website. I'll put some of my papers there. I have to update it. Sorry, it should be updated by the time this comes out. But yeah, I definitely, and also feel free to kind of send me any emails if people want to talk. That would be great.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so much, I mean, like, I know maybe it hasn't been completely updated yet, but like there's still a lot of stuff there, and some cool research on the website. So I'll definitely link that down below. That about wraps up our discussion today. Thanks so much, Professor Richardson, for your time today. I learned a lot about this really, really cool concept, or I guess multiple concepts today. And I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.